A brass wrench the size of my thumbnail hung on my keyring the night my father took my car away from me at his own dinner table without once looking me in the eye while he did it. My name is Odette Hollies. I'm 29 years old. And on the 1st of March, a Sunday, my father set down his fork, looked past me at my younger brother and said, "Your brother needs the car more. He has a real job." I had been paying the loan and the insurance on that car alone for 3 years, and neither one of them had ever known it. I said nothing at the table. I drove home in my own beat-up hand-me-down sedan with my hands steady on the wheel and my chest doing something entirely different. The next morning, at 19 minutes past 6, my brother turned the key in the ignition of a car he believed had just become his, and it did not make a single sound. Not a click, not a cough, nothing at all. What he didn't know is that I hadn't touched a single wire under that hood. What he didn't know is that I didn't have to. And what neither of them understood, not that morning, not for 3 more weeks, is that the silence under that hood was the truest thing my father had ever heard me say. Welcome back to Echoes from Grandma's Room, where the quiet ones finally get to finish their sentence. If you've ever carried something for your family that nobody thanked you for, and then watched them try to hand it to someone else, this story is for you. Comment the word engine if you've ever kept your family running without a single one of them noticing. And subscribe, because you are going to want to see exactly what my father found out at his own son's promotion party. I need to take you back 3 years, to a Tuesday in April when I was 26 years old and sitting in a hospital billing office in Tulsa, Oklahoma, staring at a number that would end up quietly rearranging the rest of my life. $11,400. That's what a ruptured appendix costs a person with no insurance and 11 days between jobs, the exact gap that fell between leaving a part-time retail position and starting a new one, the kind of gap nobody warns you is dangerous until your body picks that exact week to fail. I had graduated from Tulsa Community College with an associate's degree in finance 18 months earlier, full of a plan, and that 1 week in a hospital bed turned my credit score from a modest, respectable 690 into a 481 that took me the better part of a year to even understand the damage of, let alone begin repairing. You learn things about the world at 481 that you never learn above 600. You learn which landlords will still rent to you and at what premium. You learn that credit card companies will still mail you offers, just with interest rates that read like a threat. I remember standing in my kitchen that spring with a stack of collections, letters fanned out on the counter like a losing hand of cards, doing the math over and over on a legal pad, trying to find some arrangement of numbers that let me keep an apartment, eat something besides rice and canned beans, and still make it to a new job on time every morning without a working car to get me there. And you learn, the way I learned it standing in the gravel lot of a buy here pay here dealership called Ridgeline Motors on the east side of town, string lights strung crookedly between 2 light poles and a hand-painted sign reading "Everybody rides," that some lenders will still put you in a car, but they'll want to know at all times exactly where that car is and whether you've paid for the privilege of driving it that month. I stood in that lot for almost 20 minutes before I ever walked inside, running my hand along the hood of that same silver Civic, telling myself it was just a car, the way you tell yourself something is just a formality right before it becomes the thing that actually saves you. If you've ever had to learn an entirely new set of rules just to survive one bad week, comment the word rebuild, because I think there's a whole quiet population of people out there who understand exactly what a 481 feels like, and most of them never talk about it out loud either. And subscribe, because the job that came out of that exact gravel lot is the reason I understood, better than anyone else in my family, precisely what was sitting. The car itself was nothing remarkable. A silver 2016 Honda Civic with 102,000 miles on it, a dent in the rear bumper from its previous owner, cloth seats gone soft and slightly gray at the edges. I bought it in February, just over 3 years ago, for $9,200, financed at 19.9% over 4 years, a number I still remember down to the decimal because I read it out loud twice before I signed, the way you say a bad diagnosis out loud twice to make yourself believe it's real. The monthly payment was $231. Insurance ran another $104. $335 a month out of my own account on auto pay every single month, and I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because by the time this story reaches its end, that number is going to matter more than almost anything else in it. Here's the detail that changes everything about how you'll understand what happened the next morning, so I need you to hold on to it carefully. Subprime buy here pay here loans in Oklahoma, the kind issued to people with credit scores under 500, very often come with a condition most people never think to ask about until they're already signing. A GPS-linked payment verification device wired quietly into the ignition system, invisible unless you know exactly where to look for it, tucked up under the steering column behind the fuse panel. The device does one simple thing. Every month on the day payment posts, it receives an authorization signal and stays silent, doing nothing, letting the car start the way any car starts. If a payment is missed, the device begins what the industry calls a soft warning period. 3 days of a small chime every time you turn the key, and then, if payment still hasn't posted, a full disable, no chime, no warning, just a car that will not turn over no matter how many times you try. I know all of this with a precision most people never need to have, because 3 months after I financed that Civic, Ridgeline Motors hired me, not as a salesperson, as what the company formally calls a recovery and compliance specialist, the person who monitors exactly those devices, exactly those payment cycles, exactly those soft warnings and hard disables. For every single loan on the books, mine included, though company policy required a supervisor to handle my own account specifically, so I'd never be accused of favoring myself. I got the job because the finance manager who processed my original loan, a steady, unhurried man named Franklin Boyce, watched me sit across his desk at 26 years old and ask sharper questions about amortization and grace periods than half his own staff, and told me, on my way out the door with the keys to that Civic in my hand, that if I ever wanted to see the other side of the desk, he'd make room for me. 3 months later, he did. If you've ever had the worst week of your financial life quietly turn into the exact skill set that saved you later, comment the word leverage, because that's precisely what happened to me. And it's the reason my father never stood a chance of guessing what was actually under that hood. And subscribe, because the part where I decided to buy a second car, one nobody in my family was supposed to know was really mine, is where this whole story actually begins. My family lives in a modest 3-bedroom house in the Kendall Whittier neighborhood of Tulsa, the same house I grew up in. My father, Gene Hollies, is 61 years old and has worked as a foreman at a steel fabrication plant off the Sand Springs line for the better part of 3 decades. The kind of job that leaves a man's hands permanently roughened and his opinions about work permanently fixed. My mother, Marlene, is 58 and works part-time as a church secretary at Fellowship Baptist, a job my father has referred to more than once at family dinners as her hobby. My younger brother, Callum, is 24. And until 18 months ago, he had worked a string of part-time jobs that never lasted more than a season: warehouse shifts, a stint at a car wash, 6 weeks at a call center he quit over the phone. I want to be fair here because fairness has always been the discipline I try to hold on to, even in a story about my own family. Callum is not lazy in the way my father's frustrations sometimes made him sound at the dinner table. He struggled through most of school with an undiagnosed learning difference nobody in our house had the money or the patience to properly evaluate until he was almost out of it. And by the time anyone understood why reading comprehension tests wrecked him while he could take apart a lawnmower engine blindfolded, the damage to his own confidence was already mostly done. 18 months before the night at that dinner table, Callum landed a sales floor position at a furniture showroom called Bellwether Home, and something about it finally fit him: the hands-on product knowledge, the customer conversations, the commission structure that rewarded effort instead of test scores. He worked hard at it. I want that on the record because none of what happened afterward changes the fact that my brother earned that promotion honestly. My father bought Callum's first car for him when he turned 16, a used Ford Ranger, paid in full, cash, no loan, no lesson in what any of it cost. He never once offered me the same thing at 16, and I never asked, because by the time I turned 16, my father had already started saying the sentence that would define most of my childhood without my ever fully realizing it was a sentence at all. Odette's practical, she'll figure it out. It sounded for years like a compliment. It took me most of my 20s to understand it was actually an excuse, the reason nobody in my family ever felt obligated to hand me anything, because I had already quietly, without ever being asked, made myself the kind of daughter who didn't need handing anything to. The Civic came into the family's daily life almost by accident. 6 months after I bought it, my own beat-up first car, a 15-year-old Corolla I'd driven since community college, developed a transmission problem that would have cost more to fix than the car itself was worth. And rather than take on a second loan I genuinely couldn't have afforded on top of the Civic, I simply started driving the Corolla only when absolutely necessary, babying it along on short trips, and offered the Civic to my parents as, in my own words at the time, something the family could share while I got back on my feet. I told them it belonged to all of us. I never once told them exactly whose name was on the loan, whose bank account the $231 left every month, whose signature sat at the bottom of the insurance policy. I let them believe because it was easier than explaining a 481 credit score and a hospital bill at a family dinner table that the Civic was simply a car we all pitched in for. We never did all pitch in. Not once in 37 months. I want to be precise about that because precision has become the only language I trust completely. My father used the Civic almost daily for errands, hardware store runs, trips to visit his own mother in a care facility across town. My mother borrowed it for church functions. Callum used it on weekends when his truck was in the shop, which was often, because the Ranger was 11 years old by then and held together mostly by my father's stubbornness. In every single month, $335 left my account on auto pay. And every single month I said nothing, because somewhere in the particular architecture of my own family, I had already decided that being useful without being asked was the closest thing to being loved that I was ever going to get. And I had made a kind of peace with that arrangement, even though, looking back now, it was never actually peace at all. It was just quiet. If you've ever quietly funded something for your family and let them believe it belonged to everyone, tell me in the comments how long you carried that secret before it finally caught up with you, because mine ran for exactly 3 years, 1 month, and 4 days. And subscribe because the Sunday dinner where my father decided, without asking me a single question, to give that car away, is the part of this story where everything I'd been quiet about finally had. The 1st of March fell on a warm, unusually bright Sunday afternoon, the kind of early spring day in Oklahoma that makes everyone a little too optimistic about how far winter has actually receded. My mother made pot roast, the good china came out, and I remember noticing, walking in the door, that my father had a particular energy to him, the energy of a man who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to announce it. The same energy I'd watched him carry into contract negotiations at the plant, when he used to bring work stress home before he made foreman. Callum's promotion had come through that Friday. Assistant manager at Bellwether Home, a genuine step up, a real raise, the kind of news that deserved celebrating, and I want to be honest that I was proud of him too, sitting at that table before anything else happened. My father raised a glass of sweet tea to toast it, said something about how proud he was of a son who'd finally found real work, and I remember the specific weight the word real carried in his mouth. A weight I'd heard my whole life applied to things my father approved of and withheld from things he didn't fully understand. My finance job at Ridgeline chief among them, a job he had described to his own brother within my hearing, as Odette shuffling other people's paperwork. Then, somewhere between the pot roast and the pie, my father set down his fork, and I remember the particular quiet that fell over the table before he even spoke, the quiet of a man who has rehearsed a sentence enough times that his own body knows it's coming before his mouth catches up. "Now that Callum's got real responsibilities," he said, looking at my brother, not at me, "he's going to need reliable transportation for client visits. That truck of his isn't going to cut it much longer." He paused, and then he looked finally in my direction, though not quite at my eyes, more at a point somewhere just past my shoulder, the way you look at a piece of furniture you're deciding whether to keep. "Your brother needs the car more, Odette. He has a real job now. You've got that little Corolla, and honestly you don't drive nearly as much as he's going to need to." I want to tell you I said something brilliant in that moment, something that shut the conversation down cold. I didn't. I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth, and I heard myself say quietly, "That's my car, Dad." And my father, without missing a beat, without a single flicker of hesitation, said the sentence that I have turned over in my head more times than any other sentence any member of my family has ever said to me. "It's the family car, Odette. It's not like it's really yours." My mother did not look up from her plate. Callum, to his credit, looked uncomfortable, glancing between us with the specific discomfort of someone who has just realized he's about to receive something he didn't know came at a cost. But nobody said the sentence that needed saying, the one sentence that would have changed everything if anyone in that house had ever once thought to ask it in 3 years. Whose name is actually on the loan? I finished dinner. I helped clear plates the way I always had because some habits outlast the reasons you built them. And I drove home in my old Corolla with its rattling transmission mount and its cracked dashboard. And somewhere around the second red light, the specific cold clarity that had been building in me for years, quietly, without my ever fully naming it, finally arrived all at once, the way a circuit either holds or it doesn't, with no in-between state at all. If you've ever heard your own family describe something you built entirely alone as belonging to everyone, comment the word family, because I want to know how many of you have heard that exact sentence in some form, and I promise you, you are not the only one. And subscribe because what I did that night, sitting at my own kitchen table with my laptop open to the Ridgeline compliance portal, was not sabotage. And by the end of this story, I'm going to prove that to you the same way I have. I want to be completely honest with you about the 3 things I considered doing that night, and why I rejected 2 of them, because I think the choice matters as much as anything else in this story. Sitting there in my kitchen, the pot roast still sitting heavy in my stomach, the specific hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the apartment, I let myself run through every version of that night that anger could build. My first instinct, sitting there furious in my kitchen, was to call my father immediately and scream every single fact at him. The loan number, the insurance policy, 3 years of statements, and let the whole thing detonate over the phone in the heat of that exact moment. I picked up my phone, I put it back down. Screaming facts at a man mid-decision has never once in 29 years changed his mind about anything. It only ever gave him something to defend against instead of something to sit with. My second instinct was colder, and honestly, it frightened me a little to notice how easily it came to me. As the actual title holder and sole obligor on that loan, I had every legal right, that same night, to simply drive to my parents' house at midnight and physically take the Civic back. No explanation required, the same way Ridgeline's own recovery agents did it to defaulted clients 3 or 4 times a week. I sat with that option for almost 20 minutes. I rejected it too, not because I didn't have the right, but because I understood, with the same clarity I bring to reading a loan file, that taking something back in the dark without a single word of explanation would only ever let my father tell a story afterward in which I was the one who'd behaved badly. My third instinct, and the one I actually acted on, felt almost anticlimactic in comparison, and that's exactly why it worked. I opened my laptop, logged into my own account on the Ridgeline compliance portal, the same portal I used every single day for other people's loans, and I looked at my own file for what I realized with something like shame was the first time in months. Payment due date, the 1st of the month. Grace window, 24 hours before the standard monthly reauthorization signal expired. It was 8:40 that night. The window closed at 6 the following morning. I did not disable anything. I want that distinction to sit clearly in your mind because it is the entire hinge this story turns on. I simply did not renew it. For 3 years, every single month without fail, I had logged in and manually confirmed the authorization. A 5-second habit so automatic I barely registered doing it anymore. The last small maintenance task of a system that had quietly, invisibly, kept my family's borrowed comfort running on my own dime. That night, for the first time in 37 cycles, I closed the laptop without touching the confirmation button at all, and I went to bed. And I slept, to my own considerable surprise, better than I had in months. If you've ever finally stopped doing the one invisible thing that had been holding everything together for people who never even knew you were doing it, comment the word quiet, because I think that particular kind of rest deserves a name, and quiet is the closest word I've found for it. And subscribe because the phone call I got at 6:40 the next morning is the moment this story stopped being something only I understood. My phone rang at 6:40, my father's name on the screen, and I let it ring twice before I answered, mostly to steady my own voice. He was already talking before I finished saying hello, his voice pitched somewhere between confusion and the particular irritation of a man whose morning has not gone according to plan. The car wouldn't start, not a click, not a cough. He'd checked the battery himself, popped the hood with the flashlight from his truck, found nothing obviously wrong, no corrosion on the terminals, no smell of anything burnt. Callum was standing in the driveway, he told me, already 15 minutes late for his first day with real client responsibilities, and did I have any idea what could be wrong with it? I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, whether he'd noticed a small chime when he turned the key over the past few days. He said he hadn't been the one driving it much that week. I asked whether he'd checked his email for anything from a company called Ridgeline. He said, with real confusion now, why would he have an email from a car dealer? That's the exact sentence, the one where I finally understood how completely my family had never once in 3 years connected the car in their driveway to the loan that kept it running. Because as far as my father was concerned, that car had simply always existed, the way a kitchen table exists, without ever requiring him to wonder who paid for it or where it came from. I told him, as evenly as I could get my voice to go, that the loan and insurance had never been in the family's name at all. They'd been in mine, alone, for 3 years, and that the payment authorization I renewed every single month without ever mentioning it to anyone had, for the first time, simply not been renewed the night before. The silence on the other end of that call lasted long enough that I genuinely wondered if the line had dropped. When my father spoke again, his voice had changed entirely, gone flat and careful in a way I recognized from watching him negotiate with vendors at the plant. The voice of a man realizing, mid-conversation, that he doesn't yet understand the full shape of what he's dealing with. "What do you mean it's in your name?" he said. "That car's 3 years old, Odette. You'd have told us if you were paying for it this whole time." And I said quietly the truest sentence I had. "I did tell you, Dad. I told you it was my car. You just decided it wasn't." If you've ever had to explain calmly to your own father that the thing he'd taken for granted his entire life had actually only ever existed because of you, comment the word foundation, because that's exactly what that phone call felt like. Watching a man realize the floor he'd been standing on had a name written under it the whole time, and it wasn't his. And subscribe, because what happened over the following 3 weeks, as my family tried 3 separate times to explain this away, is where I finally learned exactly how far some people will go to avoid saying thank you. The first thing my father did, once the shock wore off enough for anger to take its place, was accuse me flatly over that same phone call of sabotage. He used that exact word. Sabotage, as though I'd crawled under the hood with wire cutters in the middle of the night out of spite, rather than simply having declined, for the first time in my life, to do a favor nobody had ever once acknowledged as a favor at all. I explained, patiently, the actual mechanics of a GPS-link compliance device, the same explanation I gave dozens of confused clients every single month at work. And I could hear, even through the phone, the exact moment my father's anger ran headfirst into something he couldn't argue his way around, because I wasn't describing an opinion. I was describing a system, the same way he described tolerances and load-bearing calculations at the plant, a language he understood the shape of even when the specifics belonged to me. My mother called that same afternoon, her voice gentler but aimed at the same destination. She reminded me carefully that family takes care of family, that Callum's job depended on reliable transportation, that surely I could see my way to sorting this out quickly for everyone's sake. I asked her as gently as I could manage whether she'd known this whole time that I was the one paying for the car alone. There was a pause long enough to answer the question before she ever said a word. "I assumed your father had it handled," she finally said, and I understood in that single sentence that my mother had spent 3 years quietly not asking the one question that would have made all of this impossible to ignore, because not asking had always been easier than the answer might have required of her. Callum, to his credit, was the one member of my family who actually apologized first, calling me 2 days later from the Bellwether parking lot on his lunch break, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. He told me he hadn't known, that he'd assumed, the way I now understood everyone in my family had simply always assumed, that the car belonged to all of us in some vague, shared way that nobody had ever bothered to define. He asked carefully whether there was anything he could do to fix it, and I told him honestly that the fix wasn't really his to make. My father was the one who had never asked. My father was the one who needed to understand. I want to give my mother her own small, honest accounting here too, because she doesn't disappear from this story after that first phone call. A week later, she called again, this time on her own, without my father anywhere nearby, and told me something I hadn't expected. She'd gone back through her own memory of the past 3 years and realized she could not recall a single instance of my father ever mentioning a car payment at all. Not once, not at tax time, not during the 2 stretches when overtime got cut at the plant and money was genuinely tight. She'd simply never thought to ask why, because in 34 years of marriage, she'd learned it was easier to let my father manage what he called the household logistics without questioning the details underneath them. "I think I've been doing the same thing to you that your father does," she said quietly, just quieter about it. Not asking is its own kind of not seeing. It wasn't a full reckoning. But it was the first time in years my mother had said something to me that sounded less like smoothing things over and more like actually looking at them. That understanding did not arrive quickly. Over the following 2 weeks, my father tried 3 separate approaches, each one revealing something new about exactly how deep his particular blind spot ran, and I want to walk you through each of them, because together they built the case I would eventually have to make in front of people who actually mattered to him. The first approach was denial dressed up as logic. He called a mechanic friend from the plant, a man named Dwayne, who came by on a Saturday morning with his own toolbox, popped the hood, and spent the better part of 40 minutes tracing wires with a multimeter while my father stood over his shoulder, arms crossed, the same posture he used to stand over union negotiations he didn't trust. Dwayne found the device tucked behind the fuse panel exactly where I'd told my father it would be, a small black unit no bigger than a deck of cards, a single wire looping back to a GPS antenna the size of a quarter tucked up under the dash. He confirmed, in blunt shop floor language, that it was a legitimate loan compliance unit, professionally installed, nothing rigged or tampered with, simply a system that had, as designed, done exactly what it was built to do when a payment cycle lapsed. He even showed my father the manufacturer's stamp on the housing, the same brand Ridgeline used on every subprime loan in the state, proof, if my father had wanted proof, that this wasn't something I'd built out of spite in my own garage. My father's response to that confirmation was not gratitude toward Dwayne for his Saturday morning, and it wasn't relief either. It was to insist, to Dwayne's visible discomfort, standing there with the panel still open and grease on his hands, that I must have set the loan terms up deliberately harsh on purpose to maintain what he called leverage over the family. Dwayne, from what Callum told me later, didn't say much back to that, just closed the panel, wiped his hands, and told my father quietly that from where he was standing, the leverage had always run the other direction. I want you to notice the particular cruelty of my father's accusation, because it took the one system that had quietly protected my family's comfort for 3 years and recast it as a weapon I'd built specifically to control them, when in fact it was simply the exact terms available to a 26-year-old with a 481 credit score and no other option. The second approach was an attempt to go around me entirely. I learned about this one secondhand from Callum 3 days after it happened, embarrassed and apologetic all over again. My father had called Ridgeline Motors directly, asked to speak to a manager, and demanded that the company simply reactivate the vehicle regardless of what he called a family misunderstanding. He got Franklin Boyce on the phone, my own supervisor, the man who had hired me off the strength of a single conversation 3 years earlier. Franklin, I found out later, listened to my father's entire account without interrupting once, patient and unhurried the way he always is, the same tone I'd watched him use on furious clients a dozen times, and then explained, in the same calm compliance language I use with clients every single day, that he was legally unable to discuss another person's loan account with anyone other than the borrower of record, and that the borrower of record in this case was his own employee sitting 2 cubicles down from him. My father pushed back, according to Callum, raising his voice enough that Franklin apparently had to hold the phone slightly away from his ear, insisting that a father had a right to know about his own family's vehicle. Franklin's answer, delivered without ever raising his own voice to match, was the sentence Callum repeated to me almost word for word because it had stuck with him so clearly. "With respect, sir, it isn't your family's vehicle on this paperwork. It's hers and has been the whole time." My father hung up, according to Callum, without saying another word. The third approach arrived by text message, and it's the one that finally showed me the exact shape of what I was dealing with. My father proposed what he called a fair solution. He and Callum would pay me back gradually, he said, $50 a month, starting whenever things settled down at the plant, in exchange for my reactivating the vehicle immediately and formally signing the title over to Callum so he could get his own insurance sorted out on his own terms going forward. I did the math on that offer the same way I did the math on every loan file that crossed my desk at work. $50 a month against a payoff balance of just under $4,000, remaining meant nearly 7 years of repayment, at zero interest, with absolutely nothing legally binding either of them to actually follow through once the car was already gone from my name and safely re-registered in my brother's. I sat with that offer for 2 full days, because I have learned through all of this that even offers built entirely on sand deserve an honest evening of consideration rather than a reflexive no. I ran the numbers the way I run every file at work, laid out on my legal pad the way I'd laid out my collections letters 3 years earlier, except this time the math wasn't about survival. It was about what I'd be trading away and for how little. 7 years of quiet $50 promises against 3 years of documented, provable truth. What that offer actually would have bought my father, underneath its careful language of fairness, was a clean resolution with no accounting attached, no formal acknowledgement that anything had been unfairly taken from me in the first place, simply a quiet return to the exact arrangement that had let him give away something that was never his to give, minus the inconvenience of my having no. I declined it in writing the same evening I finished considering it, and I told my father plainly that I would be glad to discuss the car's future once he was ready to have an honest conversation about the past 3 years, out loud with everyone who actually needed to hear it, rather than a private repayment plan designed to make the whole situation quietly disappear. If you've ever been offered a slow, informal, unenforceable version of being paid back, specifically so the actual truth of what happened could stay buried, comment the word settlement, because I promise you, the fastest way to spot a fake resolution is to notice how badly someone wants it kept private. And subscribe, because there was one more layer to this story I hadn't found yet, and it came from the last person I expected, my parents' next-door neighbor of 19 years. Her name is Odette Fenwick, 73 years old, a retired postal carrier who has lived in the house beside my parents since before I was born, the kind of neighbor who waters everyone's tomatoes without being asked and notices, without ever seeming to look, exactly who comes and goes on that street and when. Odette called me directly on a Thursday afternoon during that same 3-week stretch, a number I still had saved in my phone from years of picking up packages on her behalf when she traveled to visit her grandchildren. And she asked, carefully, whether I had a minute to talk about, in her words, something that had been sitting wrong with her for a while. She told me she'd noticed the Civic in my parents' driveway for 3 years, coming and going almost daily, and she told me gently that she'd also noticed something else, something I hadn't known anyone besides Franklin and the loan file itself had ever seen. Twice over those 3 years, she'd watched my father back that Civic out of the driveway and drive off toward downtown on a weekday afternoon when he should have been at the plant. And both times, a week or so later, she'd seen a for sale sign go up briefly in a stranger's yard a few streets over, the kind of sign that appears when someone's shopping a used car they're thinking about trading into. She'd never thought much of it at the time. It was only once word of the whole situation reached her, the way news travels a street like that one, that she put the pieces together and realized what she'd actually been watching. My father, twice in 3 years, had quietly gone shopping to see what the Civic might be worth toward something else entirely, weighing whether to simply trade away a car that wasn't even his to trade, and had backed out both times, she guessed, once he did the math on what he'd actually be losing and gaining, without ever once mentioning any of it to me. I want to be honest about what that phone call did to me, because it reframed something I thought I already understood completely. I had believed up until that point that the Sunday dinner announcement was a single decision, made in a single moment, my father simply choosing his son over his daughter at one table on one particular evening. Odette's call told me something colder. My father had been quietly, privately evaluating that car as an asset he believed belonged to him for years before he ever said a word out loud, twice testing the market on something he had never once paid a single dollar toward. And the only reason he hadn't acted on it sooner was pure convenience, because as long as the car kept running smoothly in his driveway, there was no reason yet to disturb the arrangement. There was a second piece, smaller but sharper, that came from Callum himself, a week after the cookout, Once enough time had passed that he felt able to tell me the rest honestly. He showed me a string of text messages between himself and our father from the 10 days before that Sunday dinner. Messages in which my father had already decided in advance to give Callum the Civic, and had specifically instructed him in writing, "Don't say anything to your sister about this yet. Let me handle telling her." Reading those messages, time-stamped a full week and a half before that pot roast dinner, told me something I hadn't fully let myself understand until then. The announcement at that table hadn't been a spontaneous decision born out of pride in Callum's promotion. It had been planned, deliberately, in advance, with my own father specifically choosing to keep me in the dark about a decision concerning my own property, until the exact moment he was ready to make it public. If you've ever discovered that a decision that felt sudden had actually been planned behind your back for over a week, comment the word planned, because there is a particular kind of hurt reserved for finding out you were never actually blindsided at all, just deliberately left out of a conversation about your own life. And subscribe because the community celebration my father threw for Callum's promotion, 3 weeks after that phone call, is where the entire truth finally landed in front of the one audience my father actually cared about. My father, I should explain, has always measured his own standing through a small, steady circle of people he genuinely respects, longtime co-workers from the plant, his sister Rhea and I, a handful of men from his old bowling league, the kind of modest, hard-won community reputation built over 3 decades of showing up and being counted on. When Callum's promotion became official, my father decided, with the same energy he'd brought to that Sunday dinner announcement, to throw a proper celebration, a backyard cookout on the last Saturday of March, invitations sent out to that exact circle. 20-some people gathered around folding tables in the yard I grew up playing in. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that. Franklin, when I mentioned the invitation during a quiet moment at work that Friday, was the one who asked me the question that actually settled it for me. He has a particular way of teaching, half in careful questions and half in blunt, plainly stated wisdom, and that afternoon he gave me both. "You've spent 3 years being the invisible reason things ran smoothly," he said, leaning back in his chair. "What do you think happens to a family's story about itself if the invisible part just quietly disappears from the party instead of showing up?" And then, more directly, the way he talks to new hires learning the compliance system for the first time. "Truth doesn't need you angry, Odette. It just needs you present." I brought the folder. I want to describe the folder plainly because there was nothing dramatic about it on its own. A simple manila folder, the same kind I use daily at Ridgeline, containing 3 years of loan statements, the original financing agreement with my signature and my signature alone at the bottom, 37 months of insurance payment confirmations, and a printed copy of Dwayne the mechanic's own text message to my father, confirming in his own blunt words that the compliance device was legitimate and untampered. I did not bring it planning to make a scene. I brought it because I had learned, over 3 weeks of my family trying to quietly rewrite what had happened, that the only version of this story that would actually stick was the one built entirely out of paper nobody could argue with. The cookout was in full swing by the time I arrived. Burgers on the grill, my Aunt Rhea and I holding court near the cooler, Callum's girlfriend Priscilla laughing at something near the folding tables, my father standing by the grill in the specific posture of a man enjoying being exactly the person everyone there believed him to be. He saw me arrive, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, a brief recalibration before he recovered it into a smile and called out, loud enough for half the yard to hear, that his daughter had finally. I want to tell you the confrontation was dramatic. It wasn't, not in the way you might expect, and I think that's exactly why it worked. I walked over to where my father stood, set the folder down on the small table beside the grill, and said, in a voice pitched to carry to the small cluster of people already listening, not loud, just clear, "Before everyone toasts Callum tonight, I think you should tell them why the car wasn't running 3 weeks ago." My father's smile went rigid. My Aunt Rhea and I, standing close enough to hear, set down her drink. He tried first, the same deflection he'd tried on the phone weeks earlier, waving a hand, saying something about a family misunderstanding, nothing worth ruining a good party over. I opened the folder calmly, and I laid the loan agreement on the table beside the potato salad, my signature clearly visible at the bottom, the date 3 years old. I laid the insurance statements beside it, 37 consecutive months, my name on every single one. I did not raise my voice once. I said plainly to my father and to the 8 or 9 people now quietly gathered close enough to see that I had bought that car alone, paid for it alone, insured it alone for 3 years, and had never once asked for a single dollar back. Until the night my father decided, without asking me anything at all, that it belonged to someone else because I didn't have what he called a real job. My Aunt Rihanna was the first to speak into the silence that followed, and her voice carried the particular weight of someone who has quietly suspected something for a long time and finally has the proof laid out in front of her. "Jean," she said to my father, "did you seriously never once ask her whose name was on that loan?" My father did not answer right away, and in that silence, standing in his own backyard in front of the exact people whose respect he had spent 30 years building, I watched him understand for the first time the actual size of what he'd done. Odalise Fenwick, standing near the fence line with a paper plate in her hand, having walked over from next door the way she always did when she smelled a good grill going, spoke up next, unprompted, in the plain voice of a woman who has never once in her life felt the need to soften something true. "I watched that man take your car shopping twice, Jean," she said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear it now, looking to trade it toward something else. Twice. Never once mentioned it was hers to trade. A ripple went through the small crowd at that, one of the plant co-workers muttering something under his breath, my father's own bowling league partner setting down his drink entirely. My father's face, already pale, went a shade paler still, because Odalise's word carried a particular authority on that street, 19 years of quietly knowing everyone's business and never once being wrong about it. Priscilla, standing beside Callum with her arms still around him, was the one who finally said the sentence that seemed to land hardest of anyone's, precisely because she was the newest person in that yard, the one with the least history and the clearest eyes. "He's been paying you back $50 a month in his head this whole time and didn't even know it," she said quietly to Callum, loud enough that a few people nearby caught it, and somebody just found out the real number. Callum didn't say anything. He just looked at me and then at the folder still open on the table, and I watched something in my brother's face settle into an understanding he clearly hadn't let himself reach until that exact moment. If you've ever had strangers or near strangers, be the ones brave enough to say the true thing out loud when your own family stayed quiet for years. Comment the word ally, because sometimes the people with the least at stake are the only ones willing to risk saying it plainly. And subscribe, because what my father said next, once he finally stopped deflecting, is the closest thing to an honest answer I have ever gotten from him. My father stood very still for a long moment, and then, in front of his sister, his co-workers, his own wife standing frozen by the folding table, he said something I never expected to hear from him, delivered in a voice with none of its usual certainty left in it. He told the small gathered crowd, and me, that his own father had run a small machine shop outside Sapulpa, and had never once in 18 years let my father touch a single tool that mattered, had told him plainly that his hands weren't built for real work, had pushed him instead toward a desk job at a parts distributor that my father hated every single day of the 2 years he lasted there before finally, at 20, talking his way into an apprenticeship at the steel plant against his own father's wishes. He said he had spent his whole adult life measuring worth by whether a job left your hands calloused, because that had been the only measure his own father had ever offered him, and that somewhere in 30 years of proving his own father wrong, he had built the exact same measuring stick and handed it to his own children without ever once questioning whether it was accurate. I want to be honest about what that explanation did and did not do for me, standing there in that backyard. It did not excuse what he had done. Understanding where a wound came from has never once, in my experience, made it acceptable to hand that same wound to someone else, and I told him so, plainly, right there. But it did let me finally understand the shape of the thing I'd been fighting my entire life. A measuring stick built decades before I was ever born, one I had spent 29 years quietly, uselessly, trying to be tall enough for. My Aunt Rihanna, standing beside him, said something then that I don't think my father expected from his own sister, in front of his own party. "You've been telling that boy his whole life that a desk job doesn't count as real work," she said, nodding toward me. "And it took your own daughter's desk job to keep that car running for 3 years while you never asked a single question." The yard had gone almost completely quiet by then, the grill still smoking behind them. Callum standing off to the side with his hand over his mouth, Priscilla's arm around his shoulders. My father looked at the folder on the table for a long moment, and then he looked at me, actually at me, not past my shoulder the way he had at that Sunday dinner 3 weeks earlier, and he said the words I had genuinely never expected to hear. Not that night, not ever. I owe you an apology, Odette, not just for the car, for a lot longer than that. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't the speech I'd sometimes imagined, alone in my apartment, wanting from him. But it was real, and it was said in front of the exact people whose respect he had spent his whole life building, which meant it cost him something to say it. And I have learned, through all of this, that the apologies which cost something are the only ones actually worth trusting. The real consequences, the ones that mattered beyond that one uncomfortable evening, arrived over the following weeks, and I want to lay them out plainly, because I think they matter more than the apology itself. My father insisted, over my initial objections, on formally reimbursing me for the 3 years of payments I had never asked to be paid back for, setting up his own monthly transfer, unprompted, unnegotiated. A real number, not the informal $50 offer from weeks earlier, but the actual $231 a month he now understood the car had always genuinely cost. Callum, for his part, applied for and was approved for his own auto loan within the month. A modest used truck in his own name with his own insurance. A process I helped him through not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to. Sitting beside him at my own kitchen table, walking him through exactly the kind of paperwork nobody had ever once sat down and explained to either of us at his age. The Civic itself stayed in my name. I reactivated it the same week, and I drive it myself now, my own car, finally understood by everyone in my family to actually be mine, while my old Corolla sits, mostly retired, in my apartment's parking lot, kept for sentimental reasons I haven't quite worked out yet. If you've ever watched someone finally understand, in front of the exact people whose opinion they valued most, exactly what they'd taken for granted, comment the word witnessed, because some truths only really land once they've had an audience. And subscribe, because there's one more piece of this story I haven't told you yet, the part that happened 3 days after that cookout, when I did not cry at the party. I want to be honest that some part of me had trained myself over 29 years not to cry in front of my family at all, the same discipline that let me lay a folder on a table without my hands shaking once. It caught up with me 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening, sitting alone in Franklin's office after everyone else had gone home, going over an unrelated client file that had nothing at all to do with my own family. He asked, gently, how the cookout had actually gone, once the story had made its way back to him secondhand through the office grapevine the way small office news always does, and something about being asked plainly, by someone who had no stake in the outcome except genuinely wanting to know, finally let the whole thing come loose. I cried for maybe 4 minutes, not dramatically, just steadily, the specific release of 3 years of quiet finally having somewhere to go, and Franklin didn't try to fix it or rush me through it. He just sat there, the way a good compliance officer sits with a client working through a hard number, until I was ready to stop. I want to tell you about the brass wrench on my keyring now, because I've been carrying it through this entire story without explaining it, and it belongs here, at the end, exactly where it belongs. My grandfather, my father's own father, the same hard man who ran that machine shop outside Sapulpa and never let my father touch a real tool, softened considerably by the time I came along, the way some men do with grandchildren after they've spent their harshness up on their own kids. Otto Hollies died 4 years ago, and at his funeral, going through a small box of his things my grandmother had set aside for me specifically, I found a tiny brass keychain, wrench-shaped, worn smooth from decades, in someone's pocket, with a note in my grandmother's handwriting explaining that Otto had wanted me to have it, along with the one sentence he'd apparently told her to pass along. Money moves like an engine, Odie. If one part stops carrying its share of the load, the whole thing stalls and nobody notices which part it was until it's too late to fix quietly. I've carried that wrench on my keyring for 4 years without fully understanding what my own grandfather meant by it, until the morning my brother turned a key in an ignition that made no sound at all, and I finally understood with total clarity that I had been the part carrying the load silently for 3 years, and that the whole engine my family believed ran on its own had actually been running on me the entire time. 2 weeks ago, I gave Callum an identical wrench, a small brass one I found at the same hardware store where my grandfather used to shop, tucked into a card explaining, in my own handwriting this time, the same lesson our grandfather had once passed to me. He keeps it on his own keyring now, attached to the key for a truck that is entirely, verifiably, unmistakably his. It's April now, and my father calls twice a week, and the calls are different than they used to be, less about logistics, more about actual conversation, an entire category of relationship neither of us had built much practice in before this. My mother, to her credit, has started asking questions now instead of assuming, small ones at first, whose name is on this, who's actually paying for that, questions that would have sounded suspicious in our house a year ago and now simply sound like a woman finally paying attention. Here is the one thing I know now that 3 years of managing other people's loan compliance never fully taught me until it happened inside my own family. A system can run silently for a very long time, carrying weight nobody else can see, and the people benefiting from that silence will genuinely believe with total sincerity that everything is simply running on its own. It takes a missed cycle, a single morning where the key turns and nothing answers, for anyone to finally ask the one question that should have been asked from the very beginning. Whose name was actually on this the whole time? My father spent 61 years believing real work meant calloused hands, and it took his daughter's quiet, invisible, desk job kind of work to keep his family's car on the road for 3 years before he ever thought to ask whose job that quiet work actually was. That's my story, one brass wrench, one missed authorization cycle, and a family that finally had to ask, out loud in front of everyone who mattered, exactly whose real job had been carrying them the whole time. If someone in your life has ever called what you do invisible, comment the word "seen" below, and take this as your reminder that quiet work is still work, and it never once needed anyone's permission to finally be counted. Share this with someone who's been carrying a family without a single thank you. Drop your own story in the comments.